Hi, everyone. So first of all, thank you very much for coming. And thank you, Apex team, for inviting Legal Notes to share some ideas and thoughts about building the decentralized legal structures for the protocols and the tokens. That's something that we will discuss today, and I'll be happy to share some ideas and concepts that we developed during the last couple of years. Before that, let me briefly introduce myself. My name is Nestor. I'm a co-founder of Legal Notes. And as you may know, the knowledge gives the confidence. We in Legal Notes help builders, entrepreneurs, and founders to build this confidence by sharing with them the concepts, case studies, and insights about the regulatory environments in different jurisdictions and about the requirements, regulations, and the best legal practices. And also connect them with the most suitable legal providers locally when they need some specific legal help there. That helped us to build our internal legal knowledge base, where we have different case studies and frameworks, and some of them I'll be happy to share with you today. We had the chance to work with more than 300 Web3 teams and 100 legal providers from 20+ jurisdictions, where we use this legal crowdsourcing model to collect all these insights, information, and knowledge. And some of them we have published on our blog, so please feel free to check Legal Notes Resource Center, where there are a lot of different playbooks, charts, diagrams, etc., about the legal structuring for Web3 projects. Also, it's important to say that all the information that we will discuss today is not legal advice. To stay compliant with all legal topics, as it's always important in all the conferences. So before we start, first of all, let's briefly recall what we had before the blockchain technology was invented. First, we had a centralized infrastructure. I mean, the centralized servers, hosting providers, domain registrars, databases. Apart from this, there was also centralized ownership in the form of very traditional legal entities with the shareholders and with the centralized management, with the board of directors, with the shareholders' meetings. So pretty centralized ecosystem infrastructure, both tech and legal. And this is something that made this Shiba Inu pretty sad, because there were no alternatives for the market, for the builders, for the entrepreneurs. Before the blockchain technology was invented, and where the tech market partially did the drift to the Web3 market, to the blockchain technology, or to the decentralized ledgers. That's something that provides the blockchain entrepreneurs some advantages in the market, apart from which we can discuss the centralized infrastructure, where we have the blockchain networks, or the decentralized ledgers, where some information might be stored, where the digital identities might be structured, and where also the decentralized ownership could be structured as well in the form of tokenized values or incentives. And apart from this, we also know about the concept of the DAO, which is the decentralized governance body. So all these decentralized advantages, or the advantages of decentralization, was something that the blockchain technology bring to the market and provided to the builders and to the founders, which opened up some opportunities for both the market and the founders. However, when it comes to the legal structuring of such decentralized vehicles, such decentralized projects, usually the main question is where to start. Because the most of tokens, the most of protocols, treasuries, and DAOs are fully on-chain. Usually they don't need any centralized infrastructures, any legal works, etc., etc. However, at the same time, they need to somehow interact with this existing off-chain or real world. And it's even more stressful for the lawyers, who also don't know where to start, because the existing legal system wasn't designed for such decentralized technologies and decentralized vehicle. So that's something that we will discuss today. And as the agenda, I would like to suggest to share some ideas about the on-chain and off-chain circles of the blockchain projects. also share the concept of legal wrapper for the protocols and the decentralized projects as well, and the dual entity structure, which is quite common today for the most of the projects, to help them to raise from the venture funds, to interact with the off-chain world, to be able to open the bank accounts, etc. And as the last part of my presentation, I'll be happy to share some ideas about the crypto-friendly jurisdictions and regulatory frameworks today, as well as some upcoming regulations and the questions that these regulations raise for the Web3 builders. So let's start. The first concept that I would like to share with you is the concept of on-chain and off-chain circles for the Web3 projects. So why it's important? First of all, because the natures of each of the parts of the circles are very different. When it comes to the on-chain circle, which usually includes the tokens, the protocols, smart contracts, on-chain treasury, some on-chain governance rules, that's something which doesn't need any centralized infrastructure. It doesn't need some legal entities or some registrations to exist. It's usually permissionless, ownerless, autonomous, and fully decentralized. That's the advantages of this technology today. However, at the same time, there are some off-chain players or the participants of the real world who are interested in interacting with these on-chain vehicles. Among them, we can speak about the core team of engineers, founders, and inventors who are working on the core technology. There are also contributors who would like to contribute to the ecosystem, either knowledge or source code, etc. There are also investors or venture funds who usually have their own compliance requirements, and also some other like legal documents that they have to follow to be able to invest into the specific companies. Liquidity providers like exchanges and wallets, DAO members who like to participate in the centralized voting process, etc., etc. All of these participants or all of these off-chain players need to somehow interact in the on-chain parts of the project in a compliant way. And that's, oh, sorry, something with clicker. Yeah, let's wait a bit for the next slide. Thanks. So that's where the gap exists between the on-chain and the off-chain circles for the Web3 projects. And this gap is very like big challenge for the technology adoption and for scaling of these projects. However, there is the solution. And currently, the idea to solve this problem with the gap between the on-chain and off-chain world is to build a proper bridge. Such bridges could be built in the form of the legal entities, which could form the legal wrapper for the protocol and for the project. So what is the concept of the legal wrappers for the protocols and for the DAOs? As we have already discussed, there is the gap between these two worlds. However, this gap could be solved by registering the companies which could act as the bridge between the on-chain vehicles, which are usually decentralized and permissionless, and the off-chain players who need to interact with these on-chain vehicles in a compliant way, who need to follow legal requirements, who need to work with fiat and bank accounts, etc., etc. So the idea of these legal entities is to become the legal wrapper for the on-chain part, to make it possible for the on-chain part to scale to the off-chain users, to the users from the real world, to interact with the financial institutions, to raise funding from the venture funds. And apart from these entities, I would like to highlight two specific entities, where the first one is the company which develops the technology or the source code, which then will probably be open sourced for the market and for the ecosystem, and the DAO company, which acts as the liability and governance wrapper for all members, for all participants of the ecosystem who will participate in the governance of the protocol and of the project. Just briefly touching the roadmap for building this legal structure, which could help to better understand what are the steps and when the Web3 builders usually start registering these companies to build a legal wrapper for their tokens. So as the first stage, the core team or the founders usually need to build a team to start hiring people and to raise the initial funding. That's where the dev company, or devco as it's mentioned on the slide, is important. As first of all, the entity or the legal wrapper for the core team and core contributors for the projects. Once the first stage is passed and once the initial technology is developed, the second stage is to build a community of supporters or the community of contributors to spread the word, to launch some campaigns to involve and engage more and more people into the project, and to get prepared to the third stage, which is the token distribution and which is the transfer of the ownership and the governance rights for the project from the core team to the ecosystem, or to the contributors and the ecosystem members who will then vote for some proposals, suggest some proposals to change the technology, to change the rules of the protocol, to distribute the treasury, the fee pool, etc. All these decisions then will be made by the DAO. And as the DAO will consist of the real people, it will also require the liability wrapper for itself. And that's where the DAO company is important. So let's move further to our third question, which is the dual entity structure for the Web3 projects. We briefly touched what is the main concept of the legal wrapper and why two entities, the devco and the DAOco, are included into the liability wrapper, to the protocol wrapper concept. So let's discuss what are the areas of responsibilities of each of these entities. When it comes to dev company, the first stage for the founders is usually to build a team. The second stage is to build a project or the technology. And the third stage is to build a community. That's the steps or the stages that are covered by the dev company, which also protects the core team or the contributors, the core contributors who initiated the project. And once the community is built and the tokens are distributed, that's the stage where the ownership and the governance is moved from the core team to the community, to the ecosystem. And that's where the DAO company is important, which is usually responsible for the decentralized governance, for the centralized ownership of the fee pool of the protocol and the treasury of the pre-minted tokens. And also for further liquidity acquisition, to be able to work with big financial institutions, to raise additional funding, and to probably mint additional tokens for the future rounds and for new ecosystem members. And when it comes to choosing the questions on how to choose the most crypto-friendly jurisdiction for each of these entities, first, that we usually suggest the founders to think about is to define the list of criteria which are important when it comes to choosing the country. And as we discussed the areas of responsibilities for each of the entities, it's very easy then to understand which goals or which purposes this entity should satisfy to be able to provide the team the possibility to scale faster. So when it comes to the dev company, it's important to know where the core team or the core contributors are based, at least at the early stage, because later on it will probably be very decentralized community and the ecosystem. The second criteria is related to the VC-friendly infrastructure or the legal system or the ecosystem at all in the country where the dev company is registered, as this entity usually raised the initial funding round. And the third criteria is related to crypto-friendly infrastructure, which is related to banking, to some other financial institutions, and to some other players like accountants, auditors, lawyers, who will be able to support this company in its journey in raising funds, signing different Web3-related agreements, and obtaining legal opinions. When it comes to DAO company, there are criteria which are related to the governance process, to the possibility to distribute the virtual assets in a compliant way, and to the DAO membership model as well, or to how the members of the ecosystem could become the members of the DAO. So considering this list of criteria that we discussed in the previous slide, there are some countries which are crypto-friendly in terms of their local infrastructures of like banking and different service providers and professionals, in terms of the VC ecosystem there, and in terms of the possibilities to set up the entities which will be able to serve these purposes of decentralization or decentralized ownership and governance. For the DAO company, among other countries, there are United Arab Emirates, which have some very innovative approach to the Web3 and the blockchain technologies when it comes to regulations. There is also the UK, Singapore, Estonia. When it comes to the DAO companies, that's the countries where there are the types of legal entities which could be used for the ownerless communities could be registered, like the foundations or the DAO LLCs. And among such countries, we can speak about Switzerland, we can speak about Wyoming, where the DAO LLC as the new type of legal entity exists, and some isle-based options, which are also quite popular for the crypto market. So that's the high-level overview of the framework of legal wrapper, the roadmap on how these legal wrappers are usually built by the Web3 founders, and the jurisdictions which are considered today as the crypto-friendly for the market. However, let's take a look into the upcoming regulations, which are also very, very important for the Web3 builders, because it will be very soon when the stage of the market will be transformed into the stage where the regulations will play a very, very important role and will probably affect the long-term strategy for the decentralized projects. So we experienced this year some regulations in United Arab Emirates, in some isle-based jurisdictions, in Singapore, and there are also the list of regulations which are related to virtual asset service providers, which will come into force next year. It's MiCA in the EU. It's the updates to the financial regulations in the UK. And there will also probably be some digital asset bills in the US. So next year will be very transformative for the most of the Web3 projects. And from my point of view, the main question that will probably raise for the most of Web3 builders will be the following. So, will they need to go with the regulations and become fully regulated virtual asset service providers from one side, and at the same time become able to get this flexibility in terms of storing the users' funds, in terms of experimenting with different business models, in terms of working with fiat payments and bankings? Or is it better to go completely decentralized, to build the fully non-custodial solutions, to create the completely decentralized governance model, and to incorporate the DAO membership, according to which all the assets of the ecosystem will be owned and controlled by the DAO or by the community instead of the core team of founders and developers? So that's the question that I feel the most of the founders of the Web3 projects will start asking themselves closer to the end of this year, considering the upcoming regulations for this market for the next year. And I wish to make the right decision here, considering that this market opens a lot of new opportunities for the builders and for the entrepreneurs. However, unfortunately, at the same time, brings a lot of regulatory uncertainties at this current stage of the regulatory environment. Thank you very much for your attention, and would be happy to discuss all other legal topics after my talk.
Do you have time? We have some time. Do you have time for some questions?
Yeah, feel free.
We have some time until our next talk. So does anyone have a question? Yep. Let me pass the mic to you.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. How about the risk of issuing a token and this token being classified as a security in your model?
Yeah, thanks for this question. And that's usually, like from our experience, that the first or the second question that we usually discuss with the founders on our legal sessions. According to some recent regulatory updates and some case studies, today it's less about the nature of the tokens and the rights that the tokens provide to the owners, and more about the way on how the tokens were minted initially and who controlled the treasury of pre-minted tokens and the strategy or the process of initial token distribution. And generally speaking, there might be two possible ways of structuring of this initial token minting and distribution. Centralized way, where there is usually the group of people or the entity which is responsible for minting the tokens, which then becomes the owner of the treasury of the pre-minted tokens, and which is responsible for token distribution, either through airdrops or through public or private token sale. So that's one way or one strategy. And that's where it's very important for the company to stay fully compliant with the securities regulations, financial regulations, etc. And there is another way for token release, completely decentralized one, where the decision on whether to release the tokens and some further decisions, how to distribute them, how much of the tokens keep undistributed in the treasury, and how to incorporate the incentive model for the ecosystem, where all these decisions are made by the community or by the contributors, together with validators, together with some core team members, together with advisors, together with all other stakeholders of the ecosystem, who then later on will become the DAO or the decentralized governance body for the protocol, for the network. And in this second case, considering that it was the decision of the network or of the group of people, the question of the nature of the token will still be very important. However, as this initial token release and minting wasn't controlled by the specific company, currently it will be a bit unclear like who should be responsible for this and who, for example, should obtain legal opinion to get the conclusion whether these tokens are securities or not, or whether they have to submit some prospectuses for launching these tokens. And that's how the most of like very recent L2 networks were launched. And that's how they at least try to stay compliant with the existing regulations through the concept of sufficient decentralization of their governance and ownership. And this concept of sufficient decentralization was something that helped Ethereum to avoid potential risks, regulatory risks back to 2020. And that's something that some other big networks and protocols are trying to achieve, because if the network is sufficiently decentralized, then this sufficient decentralization reduces the risks that there might be some scams or some damages for these ecosystem players, as all of them control these protocols, treasuries, tokens, tokenomics, etc. So that's my point of view on this question, as it's a bit complex now, because today, like since 2017, when we experienced this first case of security tokens, a lot of changed in terms of token release, token minting, and level of decentralization. So that's something that, from my point of view, could be taken into account when deciding like how to structure these tokens and to reduce the risks for the tokens to get qualified as securities.
Awesome. Oh, if you want to ask any more questions, Nestor, are you going to be hanging out?
Yeah, I'll be around, so happy to.
Okay, so.
Sufficient sufficient centralization. We all know that, of course. That's from Hinman's speech. Does this concept of sufficient decentralization exist anywhere else in the legal space otherwise than that particular speech?
That's the amazing question. And what I could share here is that some ideas of sufficient decentralization might be found in the case where ACC considered Ethereum or ETH as the potential security, and Bitcoin as well. I guess it was back to 2020. And some additional ideas about sufficient decentralization were slightly reflected in the initial version of MiCA, where 3 main criteria could be mentioned or could be highlighted when it comes to checking whether the protocol or the network could be sufficiently decentralized. First criteria is the technical one. And the main question here is whether the core team or the specific group of people could somehow access the funds of the third parties. Second criteria is the economical one. And the main question here is whether there is a certain group of people who can benefit more from the protocol rather than the rest of the ecosystem members, whether they can get some better rewards, some specific dividends, etc. And the third criteria is related to governance. And the question is whether the specific group of people could change the behavior of the users of the protocol or could change the rules of the protocol by changing the commission size or by changing the business model. If all these questions, if the answers for all the 3 questions are related to the DAO, where just the decentralized governance body could do any of these changes, then it could be assumed that the project is sufficiently decentralized from the regulatory point of view. However, it's still very early concept. So I guess we will see a lot more court precedents and some guidances from the regulators. At least I hope so, because now it's very, very unclear how to reach this stage of sufficient decentralization.